What's going on, fellow Maplers? Today, we've got another heated topic. One that's left the player base at each other's throats yet again. There are people whining about not being able to do 5% boss damage, and assholes yelling at them saying it's a skill issue. Let's all calm down for a second and focus on the real villain of this story, Nexon. This update is absolute dog shit, and if you're blaming somebody other than Nexon for their poor game design, you may not like to hear this, but you're a part of the problem. This video will walk through a few different topics. What's changed? Why aren't you dealing 5% damage? How this update is horribly designed? Thoughts on Nexon's decision? And, as usual, I'll sprinkle in some feedback on what actual good game design looks like, so when Nexon completely ignores these points, you'll understand how little of a fuck they actually give. But first, if you don't already know what I'm talking about, as of September 6, 2023, bossing in Reboot was changed. If you enter a boss in a party, you need to deal at least 5% damage in order to be eligible for rewards. If the party manages to clear and you're not eligible, you're shit out of luck for the week. Try again next time, nerd. That's pretty much all you need to know at surface level for the update. So, let's move on to why some players aren't dealing 5% damage. This section is important for everybody. New players need to know this as entry mechanics into bossing, and experienced players need to understand that this knowledge is critical to bossing, and at no point is explained within the game itself, which is absolutely fucked. Honestly, many experienced players don't understand this either. What mechanics am I talking about? I'll focus on 4 critical components, 3 you may not think much about, and 1 that is fairly obvious. The first is ignore enemy defense. Basically every boss monster of note in this game has 300% defense. This is a flat percent reduction in final damage, capping at 100%. So anything above 100%, you don't deal any damage to the boss. Your ignore enemy defense percent reduces the boss's defense by the percent IED you see in the stat window. When I've been helping friends who aren't dealing enough damage, low IED is incredibly common. I'll walk through an example to help determine the impact of IED. The easiest way to quickly calculate the impact of IED is to take the difference of your IED and 100%, then multiply it by 3. So if you have 70% IED, the difference between that and 100% is 30%. 30% times 3 is 90%. So 90% of your damage is being reduced. If you have 80% IED, it's 20% times 3, so 60% of your damage is being reduced. If you have 90% IED, 30% of your damage is being reduced. You get the idea. Now think about this. When you enter a party and all your party members have 90% IED and you have 80%, they are receiving half the penalty to damage that you are. This is one contributing factor to why you might not be reaching the 5% threshold. The second mechanic is that, like monsters you train on, bosses also have levels. Being a higher or lower level impacts your final damage to the boss. In Reboot, every lower level than the boss, you deal 5% less damage until you do 0% at 20 levels lower. Every level higher, you deal 2% more damage, up to a max of 20% final damage at 10 levels higher. This curve is slightly more generous in the regular servers, which is what all servers will be aligned to eventually, but I'll focus on Reboot as it is now. Let's look at an example. If you are 5 levels less than the boss, you are dealing 25% less final damage, whereas if you're 10 levels more than the boss, you would deal 20% additional final damage. Now, think about this. When you're in a party of 5 other people that are 10 levels above the boss, and you are 5 levels below, they are effectively dealing 45% more final damage than you. Now pile this on with low IED, and you can see the gap is only getting wider. The third mechanic, similar to the second, is that bosses also start to have arcane force when they are located on the arcane river, and authentic force when located in Grandis. This functions exactly the same as maps you would train on. I'll put a table on screen for this one. The lower the arcane force compared to the requirement, the greater the final damage percent reduction. When the higher the arcane force is, the higher the final damage buff. We'll take Lucid as an example. Lucid has 360 arcane force requirement. If you enter the boss fight with only 250 arcane force, your damage would be reduced by 30%. If you were to have 540 or higher, you would be doing an additional 50% final damage. Now, think about this. When you are in a party and everyone has high arcane force getting maximum benefit, and you are just meeting the requirements, or even less, they're getting at least 50% more final damage than you. Some bosses even require nearly max symbols to just do base damage to them, like the Black Mage. Again, all these things add up and really put you at a disadvantage if you don't know that you need them. Finally, the mechanic that is probably obvious to everybody, but people mistake as the sole indicator of boss readiness, even experienced players, you need higher damage. I don't really want to get into the weeds on this, but if you have everything else in line and you still aren't doing enough damage, focus on improving Star Force to 17 or more stars, node levels, potential to higher tiers, flames to have at least some percent stat, and high main stat or a combination of the two. As a side note, if someone tells you that you need X amount of stat or Y range to be ready for a boss, they have no idea what they're talking about. You need a combination of all these things to be ready to complete a boss. And this all leads me back to the problem. None of this is explained in the game itself. You just can't blame someone, especially newer players, for lack of knowledge about damage. Nexon needs to include real requirements in the boss UI. The fact that the only information about each boss in the game is really just the absolute minimum requirements to even enter the room is nuts, and leads people to seeking fragmented information across external sources. Every time someone needs to leave the game in order to find basic information about the game is no bueno. Except when it's to watch one of my videos. Make sure to smash that like and subscribe button while we're on the topic. Anyway, Nexon should add recommended requirements about exactly the things I just talked about for each boss. They should expand their IED tooltip and highlight it in like 10 different colors for people to see how important it is. Or, if they're feeling like they actually care about new players, they could even add an intro to bossing tutorial in the Maple guide that walks through these scenarios and gives some rewards, like 2x coupons or something. These things are so simple, it baffles me that they haven't already addressed this on their own. But this only scratches the surface of why this update is poorly designed. The current party finding system allows players to intentionally or unintentionally grief people looking to struggle through content as a large group. I'll show you an example. Say you're looking for a Lotus and Damien struggle party. You find a group of 6 people down to get rough and rowdy with the crew. Everyone's looking good, level 210 to 220, maybe someone's a little bit higher, ready to stomp this nerd, but oh wait, 2 of the guys in the group are mules for people that have 8,000 or higher legion, put several billion mesos into their gear, and are looking for a much quicker, straightforward group fight. These people are able to do 40% damage to the boss in 5 to 10 minutes. Alone, this fight would be a slog taking 2.5 times longer, but together, it's chump change. The fight with a group of 6 would only last 5 minutes. This leaves the other 4 party members who may be prepared to fight them as the 6th man, but at a much slower speed, struggling for the remaining 20% between them all. But everyone has to hit that 5% threshold. No one's exactly even, so maybe 1 or 2 of you are left holding the bag. Shit out of luck until next week, I guess. It's not their fault they couldn't reach the threshold. There's no good way to determine the relative power of people in your random party. Also, the fact that you have to consider if someone is too strong for your party is fucked. No solution to offer for this one, it's just a byproduct of the current design. Now let's move on to the next group that gets bent over and ravaged by Nexon. Support characters. Support characters are invaluable to parties due to their strong party-wide buffs. Now imagine any one of the gaps in damage I talked about earlier exists. That gap is now widened by the buffs provided to party members. For example, a 20% final damage buff to someone who does 3 times more base damage is 3 times more effective for them. Spread that across the party, and now support characters are in even greater competition for the damage threshold with less time to output that damage. It's actually kind of funny. Support characters are almost incentivized to ignore their role in a party until they reach high enough damage threshold before providing their full benefits. Other games which have similar participation systems implement metrics to track other types of participation, such as support healing and damage. Having this system released without that is a joke. One of the main incentives to main a support class is because of their value to a party. Because their value comes from buffs, not damage. This means they can participate in content they would otherwise be locked out of much earlier. They're still required to learn boss mechanics to stay alive throughout the fight. Their damage is just contributed through their party members instead. I feel like I need to bring this up because I've seen people hating on players who main support characters that suddenly can't reach the 5% damage requirement. Good game design gives options in playstyle. If you want these benefits, switch from your high DPS main and make one yourself. I think it's okay to argue for balancing, but don't entirely eliminate the role of support. If you keep going down this track, every single player would just choose the highest DPS classes, which is often what happens anyway. Lastly, a nerf to them is also a nerf to you, so think about that the next time someone shits on support players. So, we covered where it's lacking in design. Let's talk a little bit about implementation. Now we all know Nexon has stellar track record for perfect, bug-free implementation with every aspect of the change thought out before pushing the update, right? So you can imagine how this one turned out. First thing, color coding your stats to red, blue, and green is not a great option for colorblind players. Also, color coding rather than just making the percent damage visible, which is presumably being tracked to identify the color, makes me think Nexon devs are riding the short bus. Second thing, one would imagine that to earn high enough participation, you have to do 5% damage to the boss's health bar or health mechanics, right? Wrong. You have to do 5% of the total contributed damage. This includes damage to minions or other parts of the boss like vellum spikes, damage to the boss where it is invulnerable, overkill damage, and damage to the reward chest. It's just fucking stupid. Let's move on to Nexon's decision. Nexon has been doing a lot of phenomenal quality of life changes to the game. Some might argue these should have been implemented a decade ago. Regardless, every single one of them is constantly overshadowed by updates like this. An absolute dumpster fire with the only intention to punish players because people from other servers are upset by progression. Let me make myself clear before I continue. I do not necessarily oppose having requirements that restrict players from getting carried through the whole game. However, these should be applied to all servers if you really want it to be about integrity. The rationale they use for this is absurd. They say it's about paying for boss clears. Then, they back this up with a stat that 40% of characters deal less than 1% damage in boss fights. We need to talk about this 40% stat for a second. There is 0% chance that any significant portion of these 40% carries are being paid for like they suggest. I'm sure some are, but it isn't some game-breaking amount that requires this horribly implemented update. Also, there are several questions I have about this data and what the drivers are. I want to know how many carries are on mules versus main. You can track this through character levels. It's not perfect, but probably good enough. What percent of carries are past and Lomian, which is Absolab for boss mules, and why the fuck they only chose a month of data to look at. This seems like cherry-picking data to make their case, but the numbers they use are fucking wild when the rationale is paying for boss clears. But what the hell do I know? My main problem with Nexon's decision, and why I speculate this is a continuation of their punishing Reboot players, is based primarily on the quality of the update and timing. Oh, and that it's a Reboot-only change, obviously. The 5% damage requirement was implemented so poorly that it appears reactionary to regular server feedback rather than integrity-focused as Nexon claims. If they actually cared about integrity, they would have an actual fleshed-out system instead of a 30-minute coding project they left to the interns before they stuck them back on monetization strategies. Nexon doubled down on upcoming mobbing XP nerfs. They want their pay pigs over in regular server to know they heard loud and clear the complaints about Reboot. So they responded by cutting Reboot off at the legs, and now we suffer for it. But hey, maybe Reboot can complain about the differences in XP from the pay-to-win items, and Nexon will finally cave and implement those into Reboot as well. Soon enough, it will just be another regular server. Fuck. I delayed this video by a couple weeks to see if there would be any additional changes, and I think their strategy is hoping that people will forget and move on. After all, we are all addicted to 2D mushrooms, so that's probably the case. In conclusion, is this really the tipping point for anyone? Should you be up in arms over it? Probably not. The update is clearly mishandled and poorly thought through. as are most MapleStory updates, but it's not game breaking or anything. The reason I'm so critical is because I want the game to be better. These kind of updates create negative interactions for players and drive people away from the game. I want MapleStory to succeed. I have a ton of fun playing, and it's just tragic that we are now stuck with this poorly implemented system until who knows how long when Nexon revisits it. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Again, like and subscribe to support the channel. I'm coming close to 1K, and I'd really appreciate if you goons helped me out. And if you want to go the extra mile, support me via Patreon and consider joining the Discord to chat. We have a fun community growing there that just shoots the shit and plays MapleStory. Both links may be found in the description. Until next time.